Next, I'd like to invite Ms. Sandra Chen up to the podium for her presentation. She's going to be speaking about feeding issues and eating behavior. Sandra Chen is a registered dietitian and has been working with the Autism Clinic and feeding and swallowing services at the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital for the past 2 years. So please join me in welcoming Sandra.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. So today I'm going to chat with you guys about Moodie Foodies, also known as picky eaters. So I'll just start and I'll just do a quick little overview, but I'm going to spend a bit more time chatting about some strategies for picky eaters. So picky eating is a common issue for many children and commonly seen in children with autism. And typically, I hear a lot of the same story that, when they were an infant, feeding went well, they were eating a variety of foods, introducing solids went well, and then at about 2 or 3 years of age is when the parents start to notice their kids starting to drop foods and become more selective. And so when I say dropping foods, what I mean is, they might be eating the same food day in, day out, maybe even a few times a day, and then they get sick of that food, and then they end up dropping that food, or they stop eating that food. So you might hear me say that term throughout the talk here. And then, at about 2 or 3 years of age, they become more selective. Most of our kiddos, I find, tend to fall more under the problem feeder category instead of more of the typical picky eater. And then I'll kind of chat about the differences between the two. So picky eaters are kiddos that usually eat more than 30 foods. Foods that are lost or dropped are typically regained in time. They're able to tolerate foods on their plate, and they might even be okay with touching that food or giving it a taste. Typically, they've got more than one food from different texture groups, so that could be soft foods, crunchy foods, that sort of thing. And then problem feeders, they've got foods, less than 20 foods, and if they do drop a food or stop eating a food, it's much harder for them to regain that food. We might also see kiddos getting very upset if certain foods are in their proximity, or the smell of certain foods, or if they see other people eating foods, and they might avoid certain food textures, so like meat textures or soft textures. So that's the difference between the two there. So what are some common strategies for picky eaters? So I'm going to chat about a few different strategies. So the first one is the exposure of foods. The second is going to be the exploration of foods, and then the third one are ideas on how to expand their food repertoire. So first up, the exposure of foods. So that can look like many different things. So that can be coming to the table for family meals. That way, if they've got the opportunity to be exposed to non-preferred or new foods. It can be grocery shopping, as we can see in the picture, meal preparation, baking, cooking. It can be bringing foods to the table at dinner time. It can be helping serve up different foods to other family members or siblings. And it can also mean cleaning up the foods and bringing those foods to the dish sink. And so when the kiddo eats, with their family, there's role modeling happening. So role modeling from parents, siblings, and then role modeling if they're at school or daycare from their peers. And we find that that can be helpful because some kiddos, they become interested in a food because they've seen someone else eat that food and they're curious about it, and maybe they want to try it or taste it. Another idea at meal times is to talk about the properties of the food. So, what's the texture of the food? Is it crunchy? Is it soft? What does it taste like? Is it salty? Is it sweet? Is it sour? So just kind of creating a bit of conversation about what those foods might be like for that child. So continuing on with the exposure of foods. So it can take up to about 30 steps for a child to feel comfortable tasting or trying a food. So I think, sometimes we say, taste it, try it. And what we're doing is we're really jumping a lot of steps to the very top where there's a lot of steps in between that might need to happen for that child. So some of the broader categories for the steps to eating are tolerating a food, interacting with the food, smelling the food, touching the food, and then lastly eating the food. And so for example, touching the food can have about, even 10 steps within that. So it's touching the food with your hands, your fingertips, and then kind of moving slowly up towards their mouth. So it can be touching their arm, their cheek, their nose, their lips, and then lastly, they might have a taste. And so, if you think about it, it makes sense. If you're not comfortable touching a food, it's going to be pretty challenging to eat that food. And I just want to chat about the picture as well. So it looks like a simple picture, but there's actually a lot of great things happening in this picture. So here we've got a family style meal. They're serving foods around the table, and that way the child has the opportunity to say yes please or no thanks. The kiddo in the back there, he's got, he's eating his plain pasta, right, which is fine, but he's still, at the dinner table, a part of the meal time, and ideally, we want to try to move foods that are more challenging for that child, possibly closer into their proximity. So the bananas, for example, that could be a food that he really dislikes. And, with time, we might be able to move, trade the banana basket with the vegetable bowl, or we might be able to move the bananas closer to his bowl, like the kiddo on the right who's got the banana slices next to him. So again, it's all about working out the steps to eating and creating that opportunity for exposure. So next up is the exploration of foods. So the pictures really kind of say it all. It's making food fun, making it visually appealing. Sometimes we recommend doing a food play session for kiddos. So a food play session is going to happen outside of a meal time, because our goal is not for them to necessarily eat when they play with food. It's to get them to just interact and explore that food. And so for the younger kids, it might be, incorporating something that they're interested in. So it could be like dump trucks or, trains, and doing food play with something that they enjoy. And then so for some of our older kiddos, it might be doing, let's say, a science experiment or a taste test. Again, just engaging that child to interact with that food outside of meal times. And just some more examples of exploration. So gardening, cooking classes, baking, and we can see that can happen at any age. The exploration can happen, as young as that little guy at the top there who's doing some baking. And we do find that kiddos that are, involved in, let's say, food preparation or the exploration of foods, if they've been a part of that, they're more inclined to maybe try that food at meal times as well. It kind of reduces their anxiety or stress at meal times if they see something that's familiar to them at the dinner table. And, just to note that, even if your child is getting involved with, food play or exploration outside of meal times, but aren't quite ready to try the food or eat the food at meal times, to keep exposing that food at dinner times, because as therapists, we still consider that a success, and it still increases the likelihood of them possibly trying that food down the road. But we certainly do see some kids who might do well with food play, but translating that to eating can be a challenge. So lastly, I'll chat about how to expand their food repertoire. So as I mentioned before, so for kiddos who are eating the same foods, maybe it's very specific and it's presented the same way and it's made the same way, it's the exact same, let's say, bread or peanut butter and jam. Sometimes we see the food jagging, where they get sick of the food and they drop the food. So what are some ideas of how to get around that? So one of them is what we call making just noticeable differences to their foods. So it's making very small, very minute changes to their accepted foods, just to create that variety, to create that flexibility. So the example here of the two pictures, we've got the one sandwich shaped as a heart, it's together, and then we've got the one at the bottom where it's still shaped as a heart, but we're presenting it differently. One slice with peanut butter, one slice with jam. Other changes that you can make with this example might be changing the bread, the kind of brown bread that you're buying, could be changing the peanut butter, could be changing the flavor of the jam, shape of the sandwich. And sometimes those changes need to be even smaller than that. So as small as mixing, even 1 teaspoon of raspberry jam with the typical strawberry jam. Like, it can be very small, it could be cutting just, the corner of the crust off, not even the full sandwich. So And we just kind of caution with this strategy because sometimes if a child is very rigid with their food preferences, you might find more success with the exposure and the exploration strategies. Because if they are very rigid and if a change is made that's too big, they might end up dropping that food. So the smaller the change, smaller than you think is probably, the best way to start if you're going to try this strategy. And, if you have like a feeding therapist involved, then that's a good person to kind of chat with and get a sense of, if this is a good way to do it and just how small or big of a change you might want to make. And then the other thing that I just want to mention is packaging, branding. A lot of our kiddos get really, they get strongly associate with different packages. So if you are noticing that, or, for it might become an issue, try to remove things into generic containers, Ziploc bags or saran wrap things if you're setting it for lunch. Again, just so that you are able to buy different products and brands, and again, build that flexibility. Okay, and then the popular chicken nugget for most kiddos. And again, I'm just gonna provide another example here. So a lot of our kids, they're into the chicken nuggets, maybe it's very brand specific or fast food specific. So again, just making small changes, you might try different brands, different fast food chains, maybe see if you can move to frozen chicken nuggets, then possibly frozen chicken strips. If there's good variety there, then you might be able to move into more homemade versions, of breading it, and maybe you're deep frying it the first time, and then maybe you'll try baking it. And then slowly, you might bread a larger piece of chicken, or you might try to, cut back on the breading. So again, just making really small, minute changes to move from one version of a food to another, and just creating that flexibility for these kiddos. Lastly, just to wrap up, feeding difficulties are very challenging. Unfortunately, there's no quick fix for feeding challenges, and they take a very long time. And so I just want to kind of put that out there because, I know it's hard not to view, success as eating new foods, but, all the little steps in between, help get them to the point of maybe trying new foods. So, the last point there says redefine success, right? So are they coming to the table now for meals? Are they more interactive with food? Are they okay with foods in their environment? Those are all good steps in meal times, and as well as possibly eating foods down the road. And just continue to be persistent and patient, with your child and the things that you're trying. So that's it for my presentation, and hopefully it was helpful. Maybe there was something in there that you were able to take away, and you're like, okay, maybe I'll try that. Or maybe you're doing all these things, and it's just to reiterate the fact that you're on the right page, and feeding does take time. Thank you.